Right guys, how are you doing? I'm not plastering today. I've got a day off because I have to go to the dentist. But that's not going to stop us doing a video about plastering, or at least the theory of it. And in this particular case, whether you should sponge float or whether you should do the two-coat method. That depends on quite a few things, but you know, plasterers can be quite funny people. I mean, they can be quite arrogant. They've all got, you know, their own ways of getting the same results. So what I'm showing you is the way I understand it, and what I think is going on between these two methods. Okay, so let's get stuck into it, shall we? Okay, so first of all, you've got your wall, your surface that you're going to plaster. Okay, we're going to knock up a plaster and we're going to put our first coat of plaster on. Okay, so there's our first coat of plaster. And at this point, the wall is 1 minute old. I'll write a minute on there. And it's 1% set. Okay, so when I say set, that means, you know, it's going off hard. So it's 1% towards its final condition, the total hardness of it. So we're at 1% set. Inside this coat of plaster, there's all grains of sand with water in between. It kind of works, you know, just like a brick wall. You've got big particles, little particles, and you've got the gypsum inside, which is the cement. So we've got all these particles. So at 1 minute and 1% set, this is very loose, okay? It's very workable. When you put your trowel on this surface here, these particles have all got the potential to be pushed around, manipulated through the entirety of this distance, okay? So we've put our first coat on. What a plasterer will tend to do, he'll put it on and then he'll turn straight back round and he'll flatten it in the best he can whilst it's at that percentage, whilst it's still wet. Okay, let's just change these numbers now. Just rub this off. I mean, these numbers, they're not literal, they're just as a guideline what's going on. So let's say now we're at 10 minutes. And then that means we're at 10% set, okay? So these particles have stiffened up, the process, the reaction is starting to work. That means when we come to flatten it in, there's less potential to move all these particles and cause any ripples through the distance from your wall surface to the surface of the wall, surface of your plaster. Okay, so it's stiffened up, there's less potential for ripples. Let's change these numbers again, shall we? Let's rub that off with my finger. Let's go to 20 minutes. Wall's 20 minutes old. Now we're at 20% set, okay? Now, what you might tend to do is lay down with your second coat. So what you'll do now is you'll mix up another coat of plaster, another bucket full, and we'll put another coat over the top of your base coat, which you've taken the time to flatten in nicely. Now you may notice I've drawn this line a lot closer. That's because your second coat tends to go on a lot thinner. So let's say it's taken 10 minutes to do that. So we just changed this to 30% set for this layer, and we're into 30 minutes old. This is now, this surface here, full of less particles, like so. This is now 1 minute old and 1 minute set, this layer. So now when we try to flatten in, this is our area now where there's hardly any potential to cause any ripples. And because we're touching this, this is much wetter than this surface, okay? So now when we apply our trowel to the wall, we're only dealing and manipulating this thinner coat. As it goes on, 40, 40, this will become 10 and 10 for this, okay? So this bucket of gear is going off behind this one, okay? that's generally what happens, and you see obviously until you get to the hundreds, percents, and that's when your wall's finished. When you're in the lower numbers, when you hold your trowel will be at a very slight angle. So there's the handle, there's matey's hand holding it, there's the arm coming in. Look, when you're in the lower numbers, you're holding the trowel very flat. As the wall starts to pick up, you're able to open the trowel up at more of an angle. Okay, so when we get to 80-90% done, you're opening that trowel right up like that, and then you're using that to plane off the very surface. Okay, and if you've got a nice straight carbon steel trowel, so there's the blade of the trowel, that's pretty much the handle. It's this stretch here, just planing off and giving you general flatness. All the time we're doing this, these particles are getting more and more compressed and becoming tighter and tighter and causing a skim. So at the surface, we keep troweling it, these stay spread out, these ones get tighter and tighter. Finish that to the end. That's your 2-coat system. So now let's look what happens when you do a sponge coat. So here's the surface of our wall. This is our coat of plaster that's gone over it. Now you may notice I've drawn that a little bit thicker than this side. Reason being, if you know you're going to be sponging, you need to set yourself up for it. And what I tend to do, if I'm going to do that, if I decide to do that, I'll knock up that first coat, that first bucket a little bit stiffer, so the particles are denser in there. Okay, and it's a little bit stronger. Okay, and the reason we're knocking this up stiff with denser particles, there's less water in there, is because when you put the sponge float on there, the surface of this plaster is going to take a real battering. So at the moment, 1%, 1 minute, 1% set. Okay, get up to 10 minutes, 10% set. Give that a flatten. Okay, get up to 20 minutes, 20% set. At this point, for the 2-coat system, this is when you'll be putting the second coat on. But we're not going to do that for this, for the sponge coat. We're going to let it go that little bit further, and we're going to go to 30%. Okay, 30%. Then we're giving it another flatten. Once you get to around, let's say 40%, then we're going to take our sponge float to it. So the sponge float isn't, if you don't know, it isn't a regular sponge that you'd wash your car with. It's made of rubber. Okay, and like I say, the principle is the same as a normal float for doing your floating. So you'll have your layer of sponge, you'll have the hard plastic back, and then you'll have the handle here. Now, the trick to doing a decent sponge coat, and what the sponge is good for, is flattening out any indiscrepancies that you didn't pick up with your trowel. So at 40%, what we're doing, we're holding the sponge float, flicking loads of water on there, and what we're doing, we're creating our slip surface back here. So now this surface is at 50 minutes old, but now we've just pulled it back to 1% set. Okay, so now this is our slip coat. So now when we start bringing our trowel back to the wall and we're pushing that gear back into the wall, we're not taking anything off at this point, this is the surface of, we've kind of created the same thing that's happening. And to allow us to be able to do that, that's why we've knocked it up thicker and putting it and put it on thicker and stronger. Okay, so we wet this up, then we get to 60 minutes. And then after, so we've gone 10 minutes, and let's say for argument's sake, that's gone now, this surface has gone 20, this has gone 60. Okay, so what happens is when you knock the plaster back, it tries to catch up again. It doesn't, it doesn't sit for the same amount of time as what it would do if you knocked it up fresh. It goes off a lot quicker on you. So that is where you get the extra speed from sponge floating, because we're at 60 minutes. And then we haven't knocked up any more gear. We haven't taken time to knock up more gear. We've not pulled the wool back at all in time by putting a second coat on. And that sponge float is really good for taking out loads of ripples. The drawback from sponge floating is we picked this up at 40%. And then we knocked it back to 1% set. The problem is we've knocked off a load of strength of the plaster because we've taken it from 40%. So we've only got 60% of that ability to set and go hard left in the plaster. That's why when you sponge float, the surface is weaker. It will catch up eventually, and by troweling and troweling and troweling, it will compress down. And the weakness, if you knock it back once, in my opinion, it can take it. And you want to get back earlier on the wall to sponge it rather than later, because if you leave it to 8% and then you pull that surface back to 1%, 8%, then you've only got 20% of the strength of the plaster that you've knocked back left for it to set. And that sometimes when you start troweling up with your wet brush and everything, it will start flaking off because it's lost its ability to go hard. So that is the problem with sponge floating. So as long as you do it a little bit earlier in the wall, then you can get away with it, because I don't think it really compromises the surface of the plaster too much. In my experience, when things have been sponge floated, you come in the next morning and there's a slight, when it's dry, and there's a slight chalky feel to it. So the surface is inferior to a two-coat method. The two-coat method, you've got 100% of the strength in that plaster. It's as strong as it can be, but all is not lost. So the painter will come in and save the day. So we've got our particles, maybe a little bit denser at the surface. This is a sponge coat. Let's do this quickly. Okay, so this isn't as strong as that. What happens is when the painter comes in, and we're going to represent this in red, any decent painter, you know, when you go onto bare plaster, you have to do a mist coat, right? And the mist coat gets drawn into the wall. It doesn't sit on the surface. If you try to plaster with thick paint onto dry plaster, it creates a skin on top and you don't get very good adhesion. This is why you have to mist coat. So what happens is when you mist coat, put a layer of paint over the wall. As long as that mist coat's wet enough, that mist coat gets drawn into the surface and creates roots into the plaster. And rather than being a skin that sits on top of it, it's actually now part of the plaster. So they'll probably mist coat it a couple of times. So the next time they mist coat it, because it's kind of sealed a little bit, it won't go in as deep. But then this surface will be a little bit more secure. Maybe a third mist coat, I don't know, it's down to the plasterer, down to the painter, sorry. So then they're able to put their, because they've got a nice clean surface, when they put their top colour on, they get a perfectly good bonding. So if you sponge coat, you can get away with it, and it's down to you. Ideally, you know, you need a pretty good surface in the first place. You can get away with it on plasterboard over a painted surface if the texture to the wall's not too bad. But if you're going over something like tile adhesive, if the wall's in a bad condition, you're better off sticking to the two-coat system. If you're a new plasterer or you're looking at this for tuition, I would recommend sticking to the two-coat system because you need to really get the hang of how to do it properly, if you like, before you can start getting to the point where you break the rules and cut some corners and get away with it. Okay, so completely depends what the job is. You know, if you can get away with it, if it's a small area and you just got one wall and you're doing it in the afternoon after a day's work, sponge coat. You know, it's quicker. You use less material in the end. So that's what happens when, in my opinion, you sponge float and you two coat. I think that's it for today. I might do some more theory in the future, but I've got some other videos up. I've been doing this quite recently and I've had quite a lot of response. I'm sure I will get plenty of comments about this. But yeah, have a look at the channel, MasterSmurf74. I'm getting old. I wouldn't mind a bit of a sideline if I can make some money out of these videos, so that would be awesome. Cheers guys, thanks for watching.